Hello viewers and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. In a previous video, I introduced and reviewed the 5th Warlord of the Warlord cycle of war packs, Torquemadacotes, as well as his associated signature squad. But today we'll be taking a look at the remaining non-signature cards for each of our 7 base factions that were included within the Threat Beyond War Pack. Although by the time of making this video, we've seen the release of the Warlord cycle in its entirety, in addition to the Great Devourer Deluxe expansion and even broken into the war packs of the Planetfall cycle, today I'm only going to be assessing and discussing the card combinations and synergy available when this expansion set was first released. Although I will share the benefit of having significant foresight when it comes to assessing each new card's future potential. Yet, nevertheless, in later videos while covering future releases, rest assured that I'll revisit each of these cards when appropriate to do so, the moment that new powerful uses and combos become suddenly possible through the evolution and growth of our card pool. So, because I'm sure to miss or otherwise exclude some uses for these cards over the course of this video, be sure to mention your personal favorites and particularly clever, perhaps situational combos in the comments section below. But with that said, let's get our evaluation started. So first up today, we start with our Space Marines, and of 2 total units, we'll begin with Fire Drake Terminators. For a lofty 5 resources, they have 2 command icons, an attack value of 3, and a pool of 6 hit points. They possess the Soldier, Salamanders, and Elite traits, as well as Reaction. After this unit is declared as a defender, deal 1 damage to the attacker. So, by no means inexpensive, this is nevertheless a fantastic counter to swarms. 2 command icons means that it's likely to exceed enemy units or at least manage to break even, but regardless as to how it fares during the command phase, it's bound to be extraordinarily stubborn and bothersome in combat. It not only attacks for 3, but has a significant reservoir of hit points, though undoubtedly the most useful aspect of this card is to offer a possible answer to our popular meta. Given our present card pool, we very much favor large numbers of individually weak units, and especially against any of our warlords which generate tokens, the Fire Drake Terminators can destroy literally any number of units. It may not seem like much at first read, but this elite unit deals 1 point of damage to each unit which attacks it, and critically important to consider is that that damage is dealt upon your Fire Drake being declared defender, which occurs before the attacking unit assigns any damage. So, if a moderately durable unit is attacking these Terminators, they simply take 1 point of damage, which they can shield away. But if a unit only has 1 single hit point, whether it's the result of having been previously wounded, or that's simply the extent of its base printed HP, then its controller has to shield against this reaction if they want their unit to survive to even attempt to deal damage. Because whether or not the defending Terminator's controller decides to shield against that incoming attack or use any damage prevention effect, their opponent in that case still must spend a shield card of their own, lest they even hope to maybe accomplish anything. And considering further that attacking is never optional, unless one is specifically using one of their combat turns to retreat with their Warlord, if the Fire Drake Terminators are the only unit you have at a planet, and your opponent has run out of shield cards, it's entirely possible that they may end up throwing away multiple army units and tokens simply because they're left with no other option but to accept a suicide mission and being forced to attempt to take down your Fire Drake with no possible means of succeeding. Plus, although no one elite trait unit is immune to powerful single target removal, ranging from card effects which deal damage or those that outright rout units, the Fire Drake Terminators can be returned to play via fallback if destroyed. And important to note is that this card is not loyal. Therefore, the Terminators may make a fine addition to the Astra Militarum, as they count as a soldier, or, considering Commander Shadowsun's predilection for augmenting units, anything from a Shadowsun stealth cadre to a repulsor impact field can make the Fire Drake Terminators an absolute nightmare for your opponent to attempt to surmount. The signature support communications relay, in addition, will go miles in helping to protect this if attachment affixed unit from Archon's Terror or Klavex Warleader, and if left to sit at a planet, the Thunder Hammers of these Terminators can smash through any number of Chimera tokens. So, this unit is exceptionally expensive, and elites aren't exactly in high demand, but as a response to our current meta, it's respectably powerful. What I especially like about the Fire Drake Terminators are that they still pose a threat to the enemy even when exhausted in combat, whether it's due to Eldorath Starbane or Suppressive Fire. Although they themselves will be unable to attack, they'll nevertheless be potentially able to inflict considerable amounts of punishment out to one's enemy. So, as with any SM unit, Indomitable is a great means of negating a single large value attack, and after blocking a one-hit knockout, hopefully you can simply let the remainder of your opposition crash and break upon this unit's Storm Shield. Plus, though the resources invested may begin to become prohibitively expensive at this point, they also make a fine accompaniment for an honored librarian. Plus, perhaps the most devious combo with the Fire Drake Terminators is to augment their 1 damage reaction if left unshielded with 1 or more copies of Crushing Blow, which again ensures that you deal damage to the enemy before they manage to assign any damage at all to your Terminators. So, an exceptionally powerful card held back only because of simple meta solutions to expensive elite units. But whether you run these elites now or simply wait for the meta to shift towards something more high-cost unit favorable, there's certainly a unit worth considering. But next up, we happen to see a second Space Marines faction unit, the Imperial Fists Siege Force. For the cost of 2 resources, they have 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, as well as 2 hit points. They possess the Soldier and Imperial Fists traits, as well as reaction. After you deploy this unit, rout 1 or more target ally units at this planet. So, for the cost, their statistics are entirely fair. Plus, it's a soldier, so when played with Astra Militarum, you can benefit from multiple synergistic effects. But the primary allure of this unit, as with most any, is its ability, the reaction of routing 1 or more target ally units at the planet where you deploy it. Granted, there aren't many ally units, but the Siege Force can be valuable in regard to helping win command. Not only can it easily match an opponent's 1 command icon, but by routing 1 or more enemy allies at a planet, it can win you command struggles you would otherwise lose. So, consider that allies like Recon Drones or Bealtan Guardians stand not only to be removed from a planet, which eliminates their associated 2 command icons, but they then return to a planet alongside their Warlord during the command phase, and since they'll be exhausted upon arrival, they do not contribute their icons, and of course, those allies will go into the first round of combat exhausted as well. But while this unit does sound great in theory, it's not quite as good as it may seem, because any unit with card or resource bonuses like the Rogue Trader, Void Pirate, or especially Eldar Survivalist, despite not actively contributing to your opponent winning command, if they're routed and then move to a planet alongside their controller's Warlord, a command struggle won at that planet will result in the acquisition of their associated bonuses. And considering Warlords generally win command struggles automatically, that possibility is quite likely. But all the same, the Siege Force may result in you winning a command struggle you otherwise wouldn't, and whether or not you manage to block your opponent's various bonuses, you're at least likely to acquire some cards and resources yourself, and depriving those same of your opponent. So, if you're looking for a 2-cost economy card, these could contest the position traditionally held by Iron Guard recruits or Sanctioned Psyker, because if you're leaning toward aggression, the Imperial Fist's Siege Force certainly pack a bit more of a punch. And if you want to be all but guaranteed that a drop pod assault will work, then inclusion of these units in your deck means that you have additional chances to encounter a Space Marine, and they're of course eligible for a wide range of other SM-specific effects. It's worth mentioning too that by being able to target one or more allies, you can target all of your enemies and spare all of your own, or perhaps if you're expecting to lose the command struggle, suffer from area effect, or are in fear of the global damage explosion from a present gleeful plague beast, you could use this method of routing to preserve your own ally trait units, and perhaps move them from a losing command battle to be relocated alongside your own Warlord, so that you might derive benefit from additional card or resource bonuses of your own. So this is definitely a compelling card and one strongly worth considering. Granted, there aren't many high value or otherwise dangerous allies at present, but there's certainly to be all the more and all the more powerful as our card pool develops in time. But as last of our Space Marines trio, up next is an attachment, the Nocturne Ultima Stormbolter. For a cost of 3, it has 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, and both the war gear and weapon traits. It reads, attached to an army unit. Reaction: after attached unit damages an enemy unit by an attack, deal damage equal to attached unit's attack value to another target at the same planet. So this is an expensive attachment, and to get the most out of it, you'll likely want to affix it to an equally pricey unit, something along the lines of an Honored Librarian or White Scars Biker at least. And at that point, you've started to invest a huge number of resources all into one rather destructible or tragically removable unit. But you definitely pay for a powerful effect. So long as the attached unit attacks and manages to deal damage, you can pick another target unit at the same planet and deal damage equal to your unit's attack value to that unit, which can be the enemy Warlord. So, with this attachment, it's entirely possible you could destroy 2 units with every attack. And note that this attachment does not specify that you deal damage equal to your unit's printed attack value, meaning that any attack augmenting effect will increase the damage dealt by this attachment. So, whereas Catachan Outpost will not make your Stormbolter more lethal, although it will help you overcome enemy shields and therefore guarantee your attachment can trigger, an effect like Rally the Charge could make a Stormbolter wielding unit utterly devastating. This is a card that also stands only to become all the more powerful as we see more unique Space Marine units, because having that characteristic in particular generally results in more stubborn and difficult to remove cards. So, this is an enormously expensive attachment, but it does come with 2 built-in shields, and depending on how the meta may shift, this could be a card that certainly surges in popularity. For instance, we just finished covering the Fire Drake Terminators, and if you're going against that unit, if you attack a different enemy, then use the Stormbolter to deal damage to the Terminators, or perhaps a unit with repulsor impact field attached, then you manage to avoid that damage upon declaration or receipt of attack effect entirely. And also, you can use this effect to target units that can't be conventionally attacked, such as an enemy honored librarian in the presence of any other unit. So, although because of the price, this is somewhat unlikely a card to often see play, it nevertheless does definitely come with a considerable bit of built-in shield value, and therefore always merits at least some consideration for deck inclusion. Plus, if you're allied with Tau, your Earthcast technicians can easily help you to retrieve this card, and during the late game, even one 2-pronged attack could end up making a tremendous amount of difference. And, unlike Iron Halo, it doesn't compete for a Space Marine Warlord's Relic slot, which means it might be a bit more competitive a card in some cases, seeing it how it won't contest their signature attachment for one in-play at a time relic if it does end up being deployed. But, as a final piece of advice, ensure if at all possible that your initial target has no means of preventing an attack, such as Indomitable or Custom Field Generator, because that will not only negate your attack, but also prevent this attachment from triggering its reaction entirely. Therefore, your order of attacks is definitely something you always need carefully consider. Still, with our Space Marines faction now thoroughly covered, we're on to our Orcs. We get 3 new cards, 2 of which are incredible units. First, we see Evil Sun's Warbiker. For 2 resources, you get a 1 command icon unit with 2 attack value, 2 hit points, and the Warrior and Boys traits. Following the trend of Warlord augmented cards, this unit gets +2 attack while it is at a planet with a Warlord. So, as we've seen with similarly priced units from other factions, for a minimal investment this unit outputs maximal damage. Just like the Bloodied Reavers and Borkon recruits, for the cost of 2 resources you often have an attack value of 4. So this unit can not only help win you command, and not just survives a single point of incidental damage without the assistance of shields, but if you have initiative or can benefit from various devious card effects, it can pack a hell of a punch and is great for deterring the enemy Warlord from being commit to planets where these units are deployed. Plus, even outside of a battle that involves a Warlord, such as that which may often happen at Planet 1, it still attacks for 2, and while that is suboptimal, this unit still helps corral the enemy Warlord and is a stellar means of protecting your various economy units. Your opponent is far less likely to try to kill your card or resource bonus units if you threaten them with the potential to shield an initial attack made against a defending Evil Sun's Warbiker, and then threaten to swing back for 4 in return. But where this unit becomes truly powerful is in conjunction with other effects. For instance, as it's an Orc unit, you can use Teleport-a-Pad to move it to the first planet after an enemy attacks, or instead, you can use that same inter-attack action window to use a copy of Staging Ground to deploy one of these units at the planet of your choice to attack one of your opponent's units, ideally for a full unexpected 4. Plus, it's certainly worth considering that this is a warrior and therefore synergizes with myriad Astra Militarum card effects. If destroyed, you can replace it with an Elysian Assault team, and until then, alongside Colonel Strachan and with or without Staging Ground, it can attack for an incredible 5. So this is undoubtedly a fragile unit, but it's not exactly disagreeably frail, and as we're just laid out, there are certainly a range of extant card effects which make surprising your opponent via deployment or relocation of this unit very readily possible. So an extremely strong contender for any eligible to include factions 2-cost slot, and so long as you're mindful of initiative, or otherwise simply opt to leverage the advantage of any number of devious card effects, this is an army unit which can in many ways be used to simply devastating effect. Still, as a second extremely compelling contender for any capable of including decks 2-drop slot, we have the Snakebite Thug, and between these two army units, the Orc faction competitive standing has been elevated considerably. But in any case, for the cost of 2, we get a 1 command icon unit with an attack value of 3, 4 hit points, and both the warrior and boys traits. It has forced reaction. After this unit resolves its attack, deal 1 damage to it. So, somewhat akin to a Warlock Destructor, this is an inexpensive unit with a bit of built-in drawback, but instead of having to pay additional resources to keep it in play, it's essentially suicidal, as it chips away at its health pool after each and every attack. But, though it doesn't output quite so much damage as Evil Sun's Warbiker generally does, it's significantly more survivable, and critically important to consider is that not only can you shield against that 1 point of self-inflicted damage, but further, note that it occurs after you resolve its attack. So even if it does ultimately destroy itself, it can regardless serve to damage or outright destroy an enemy. Consider also that all the same AM synergy applicable to any warrior trait units, like the Evil Sun's Warbiker, also apply here. The Snakebite Thug is not just an enormously resilient and stubborn unit to deploy at Planet 1, but it can also be an immense source of frustration for your opponent if put into play via Staging Ground, because if there's anything your opponent probably doesn't want essentially ambushed into play, it's a unit with a 4 hit point reservoir. Plus, whereas the Evil Sun's Warbiker has only 2 HP, this unit benefits dramatically from being present alongside Nosdrag, because Brutal on a 4 hit point unit can increase that base 3 attack value considerably. So it does have a bit of a built-in drawback, but is likely to provide enormous value regardless. So either alone or alongside the Warbiker, definitely a unit worth considering in any AM, Orc, or Chaos faction deck. But to round out our new trio of Orcs, we also see a support. For the cost of 3, we have Mork's Great Heap. It is unique and has a loyal icon. It has the upgrade trait and reads, each non-token Orc faction unit you control gets +1 HP. So this is hugely expensive, but does provide a global effect. All of your non-token Orcs become more durable, and it's worth noting that this also includes your Warlord. So if you're running Nosdrag, all of your Orcs not only require 1 additional point of damage to kill, but it's all the more difficult for an enemy to bloody your Warlord, and with larger HP reservoirs, any unit that becomes brutal stands to become all the more threatening and also has a much greater chance of surviving long enough to make 1 or more very high value attacks. Plus, it's also worth remembering in this case that multiplicative effects always occur after additive ones, so if you place Cyborg Body onto a unit, it receives its +1 HP bonus prior to doubling its hit points. So this is appallingly expensive, but does provide considerable power. You just have to find the appropriate time to play this, because it's likely to be taking the place of several other units. Orcs, as a faction, generally suffer from lackluster command, and paying 3 resources for a single support, which has no positive influence upon one's economy, could be a financial risk that an Orc player may struggle or be entirely unable to recover from. Mork's Great Heap is excellent in that we've seen scarcely few means of removing supports, so once you do put this card into play, it could be an immense source of frustration for your opponent. But there are also definitely enough card effects offering single target removal that, played late during a game, this support may end up doing little for you. Generally, offensive effects are far more desirable than defensive in Conquest, but that's not to say that they've no value. But another problem with this card, of course, is that it's unique, and therefore you won't want to include many copies in your deck, lest they end up as dead, unnecessary draws at some point. All the same, though, considering it does augment your entire army, this is certainly an effect worth considering. For one resource, your Goth boys played at the first planet have 3 attack and 3 hit points, and this gives you another hit point with which to ready your Nozdreg's Flash Gits. Plus, it even allows Zogwart's Runt Herders to potentially spawn an additional token, though note that any and all Snotlings remain tragically unaffected by this support. So, if you're going to run this card, by all means prioritize attempting to win resources, and perhaps supplement that strategy with compensatory effects like Ammo Depot, which afford you additional card draw. And if you're really looking to create a huge hit point disparity between you and your enemy, consider also running effects like Daka Daka Daka, because this support makes it all the more likely that your units will survive and your opponents will not, leaving you with all the greater a numerical advantage. All the same, in progressing past Orcs, we next move to Chaos. We have 3 additional cards, and first are our Noise Marine Zealots. They're a 3-cost army unit with 1 command icon, a printed attack value of 2, and a pool of 3 hit points. They've the Warrior and Slanesh traits, and this unit gets +2 attack while it is at a planet with a Warlord. So, by now familiar, this is yet another instance of a unit that gains an attack bonus when alongside a Warlord, whether yours or your enemy's. It's on the more expensive side of these units' cost curve, so while it can do the same 4 damage as many 2-cost versions, it is ever so slightly more durable with the additional hit point. At present, its traits provide no notable benefit, but in a Zerathir deck, considering its cost of 3, it's an excellent contender to surprise your opponent with by Infernal Gateway. And if you're considering that strategy compared to the equivalently cost Khorne Berserker, although the latter unit is somewhat hardier and has Brutal, the Noise Marine Zealots, in the presence of Zerathir, can swing for an initial 5, and considering you'll want to front load as much damage before an opponent can retreat their Warlord as is possible, the difference between this unit's 5 and a Berserker's augmented 3 is considerable. So, certainly worth considering, but likely as an alternative to Khorne Berserker instead of a supplement. You could use it primarily for offense, or instead to protect your economy units. But whether you're more interested in simply front-loading damage, or instead want a survivable, still imminently threatening unit to deploy anywhere on the battlefield, both of those options each provides its own similar appeal, and like the Evil Sun's Warbiker, the Noise Marine Zealots are nothing if not versatile. But next we have a Chaos support. It's the Turbulent Rift. For 1 resource, it has the location trait and reaction. After you deploy an elite unit, deal 1 damage to that unit, to deal 1 damage to each enemy unit at that planet. So this allows your elite units to interplay like a wrecking ball. You simply deploy an elite unit to a planet where hopefully sit multiple vulnerable enemy units, and this support affords you the opportunity to wound each of those units without the drawback of friendly fire. Unfortunately, this effect has to occur during the deploy phase, as at present we've no way to ambush Chaos Elites into play. And though we don't see many elites played by most factions, especially in the context of our current meta, thanks to the existence of cultist tokens and other various card effects, Chaos is more able than any other faction to be able to put a significant number of elite units into play. But there is unfortunately a bit of a timing problem inherent to this card. That is, you have to deploy your elites after you draw and put this thankfully inexpensive support into play, and in pursuit of getting the most benefit from Turbulent Rift's global damage effect, you may end up inadvertently deploying your elites suboptimally by perhaps playing those elites at a planet with several exposed enemy units instead of deploying your most powerful demons to planets that may end up being much more important to the overall outcome of the game. But I think upon normal situations, by the end of a given match, your opponent will generally try to pile as many units as possible upon one decisive planet, and if you have one or more copies of this support in play, because remember, they're not unique, you could play one or two elites in order to damage your enemy considerably. One copy of Turbulent Rift can result in a huge amount of damage dealt to your enemy, and multiple copies of this support, or multiple elites, or possibly even both, makes that already significant damage burst immediately transform into an enormous or even insurmountable problem. It's a shame that because of the deploy phase necessity of playing elites, you cannot have Zerathor present at the planet when and where your unit is played, but if the elite you play happens to be a Gleeful Plague Beast, you could play that unit, activate any number of copies of Turbulent Rift, and then, with the help of Zerathor being subsequently commit to that planet, you could deal out another 2 additional points of damage to the entire enemy army, which, in the right situation, could easily scour an entire planet of enemy units. In general, people dread cards that have Area Effect 1, and this support in conjunction with other effects could be infinitely worse. So, although contemporary decks indeed don't include many elites, I'm certain it's only a matter of time until players begin to rue the existence of this card. So, you could easily save your cultist tokens, splintered path acolytes, and demon elites for the end of the game, and then set yourself up to decimate your opponent. This isn't a card that sees play now, but its potential is incredible, and the moment that elites begin to appear more favorable, I strongly recommend you reconsider this card. Plus, with all the resources you'll be spending on your elites, should some enemy unit end up surviving your damage, because, of course, none of this damage is immune from intervening shield cards, apart, of course, from the damage you dealt your elite in part of the cost to play this event, then perhaps something like Doombolt might make a resurgence as a cheap, affordable means of dealing out unavoidable, killing, coup de grace style blows. So this is a compelling card, and one which pressures players to attempt to make elite-heavy decks viable. It may someday be a nice alternative to Warp Storm, as it doesn't affect your own units and cannot be easily cancelled or countered. Particularly because support destruction is rare, this remains an intriguing card. Unlikely, I think, to see play contemporarily, but someday I foresee this card becoming an absolute menace. Still, as last of our Chaos cards, and another potentially immense source of damage, we have the event Cacophonic Choir. It's a 2-cost event with 1 shield icon and the Power, Maneuver, and Slaanesh traits. It has deploy action. Exhaust your Warlord to have your opponent deal X indirect damage among units he controls. X is the number of units your opponent controls. So, this is another example example of an event which leaves your Warlord terribly exposed, and considering that Zarather is far more fragile than Kugoth, you'll want to make the decision as to whether or not to include this card in our former Warlord's deck exceptionally carefully, because whenever you enter combat exhausted with your Warlord, you risk being bloodied or even destroyed by your opponent, especially against a faction that can run any number of ambush units like a Klavex Warleader, an event like Gift of Isha, or a support like Staging Ground, all effects which could serve to inflict a significant, potentially game-deciding bit of punishment upon your most valuable unit. But when you do trigger this event, the amount of damage you may deal out to your enemy could be monumental, because they suffer 1 point of indirect damage for each unit they control, including their Warlord and including all tokens. So, in this case, the more units your opponent has in play, the better, and considering that your opponent must assign all of that damage as indirect, it means that they cannot place more damage tokens on any one unit than it has remaining hit points. And in the context of our current meta, which places high value on playing as many cheap units as possible, this is almost certain to result in a lot of dead units and or a wealth of spent shield cards, especially if you can rest fairly certain that you'll be able to commit your Warlord to a reasonably safe planet. This could threaten to kill a huge swath of units, and frail economy units, low HP ranged units, and dangerous Chimera and other tokens are all particularly susceptible. Plus, although this card is unlikely to accomplish everything by itself, it's nevertheless a fantastic means of depleting your opponent's hand of present shield cards, and forces them to make myriad difficult choices for each indirectly damaged unit, only for you to hopefully follow up their arduous decision with a range of punishing, unexpected card effects like Warp Storm or Gleeful Plague Beast, to really capitalize upon that potential dearth of shield cards. So this is an intriguing event. If your opponent does have a huge number of units, this effect could make a tremendous difference. But on the other hand, if your opponent has managed to accrue a great many combat and economy units, you may not be in the best position to attempt to recover. Plus, not only is an exhausted Warlord all the more exposed to assassination attempts, but you also don't win command automatically in addition to having pay for the card and 2 resources all invested in this event. So, Cacophonic Choir is not always a great effect, but I think it's regardless a useful scaling late game finisher style card, something perhaps best used to soften up an enemy immediately prior to their being brought down by myriad other follow-up effects. It's particularly intriguing that it's not a loyal card, and as a result, some Orc and Dark Eldar faction players have been using this against a high-volume unit meta to produce significant results. So perhaps the worst time to play this event is if your opponent has several very high HP units with which to serve as convenient damage sponges, but it can certainly pay off in spades if you do threaten the death of a range of low hit point units. So I certainly suggest you try Cacophonic Choir, but don't necessarily expect it to work wonders. In the right time and place, it can undoubtedly be a game-changing event, but considering the risks that you run in triggering this effect, that change in game state may not be in your favor. But in moving beyond chaos, next up are Dark Eldar, and the first of 3 new additions is the Kabbalite Halfborn. For 1 resource, it has no command icons, an attack value of 1, and a single hit point. It has the Warrior and Kabbalite traits and interrupt. When this unit leaves play, draw 1 card. So this is an inexpensive unit, but is terribly underwhelming. Granted, when it leaves play, you draw a card to essentially replace this unit, but while it is in play, it certainly isn't accomplishing much. It doesn't contribute to winning command, and should therefore be positioned to battle, but it's almost certainly going to be your last choice with which to attack, and your opponent's last choice to attempt to destroy. A single point of damage is often enough, easily ignored, and generally something trivial to shield, if you have to. So, though by the time it leaves play, you may only have lost one resource and a small bit of economy tempo, this unit does little by itself, but does invite possible combos, and does draw you a card during combat when you might be desperate to draw some sort of useful trick. At the moment, playing this with Craft World Gate means that you essentially have a once per round, reusable means of transforming one resource into one card by using that support to return this unit to your hand, and it's conceivable that sooner or later we'll eventually see enough additional low-cost units with when enters or exits play style effects to make a deck which runs Calamity viable, the neutral event which returns units that cost 2 or less to hand during the headquarters phase, but as is, the Halfborn affords you an additional card draw and, if bounced to hand by some kind of card effect, is inexpensive to return to play, and could therefore be readily playable alongside units like Murder of Razorwings, which themselves have a beneficial when enters play type effect. In that case, a mandatory random card discard by your opponent. Still, at the moment, any kind of unit bouncing combo seems like far too much work for relatively paltry reward, and generally, players want at least a command icon on their one-cost units. There is a tiny amount of available Kabalite synergy at present, in the form of the Bladed Lotus Rifle, a one-cost attachment which would transform the Kabalite Halfborn into a 2-attack value ranged unit, but if building a unit like that is your ultimate goal, simply opting to run a Sybarite Marksman would save you one card and one resource for a basically identical unit. Save that card draw. So, at the moment, this is a woefully underwhelming card, and I cannot recommend it. So, while someday we may see our various Kabalites rise together to competitive prominence, perhaps under the banner of some third upcoming Dark Eldar Warlord, their day in the sun is most definitely not now. But next up, we have a very unusual and particularly meta-sensitive card, an attachment called Shadowfield. For the cost of 2, it has 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, as well as the War Gear trait. It reads, attached to a Dark Eldar army unit. Attached unit cannot be dealt damage by an army unit with printed cost 2 or lower. So, for a bit of an investment, this bit of equipment serves to make the attached unit situationally immune to damage, and in the right situation, this card can grant an immense amount of stubbornness. If your opponent cannot return your unit to hand, rout it, attack it with tokens, or outright destroy it through various other eligible card effects, if all they have in a given battle is one or more 2 or fewer cost army units, then this attachment could essentially win you a battle against any number of opponents. It's particularly nice that it confers immunity to not only attacks from eligible units, but further any source of damage. So, Shadowfield allows you to ignore damage dealt out through abilities, such as that of Rotten Plague Bearers, whose effect is prevented entirely. Still, it's going to be critically important to keep in mind that damage through card effects and not units can still damage the attached unit. For instance, a Nocturne Ultima Stormbolter attached to a 2-cost Blackmane Sentinel will still damage the Shadowfield equipped unit, because in that case, it's the attachment doing damage and not the actual unit. But whether you end up playing this attachment or not, if it finds its way into your deck, it still stands to provide a significant number of shield icons. And note that when it does come to 2 shield options for Dark Eldar, Shadowfield is more expensive to play than Suffering, the -2 attack value attachment intended for enemy army units. And it works on a far narrower range of units, but it can affect any number of armies and potentially negate an infinite amount of damage in the right situation. All the same, it's definitely worth considering that the Shadowfield equipped unit is still probably easily dealt with. Not only will it be a priority target for the enemy Warlord, but unless it's facing down a veritable army of 0 to 2 cost units, then it's not going to be able to win battles alone. Plus, it's trivial enough in general for most factions to deal with one unit strictly through card effects, but all the same, playing this attachment could essentially force your opponent to send their Warlord to the destination of your choice, or otherwise perhaps consume one of their other powerful cards, simply because they have no other convenient means of dealing with this unit. Overall, this is a very curious card, but again, if nothing else, the value intrinsic to this attachment will only ever be as low as its considerable printed shield value. So, as a result, it certainly sees play in modern decks, even if it doesn't exactly accomplish stellar results. So perhaps include it for now as shields at least, but should the opportunity present itself, never forget how useful Shadowfield could be when played during anything at all approximating an ideal opportunity to do so. Still, last of our Dark Eldar trio, we have an event. For the cost of 0, we see Slake the Thirst. It has 1 shield icon and both the tactic and maneuver traits. Action: exhaust your Warlord to discard up to 3 cards at random from a target player's hand. Then, that player draws cards equal to the number of cards discarded. So, clearly this is an intriguing effect. Typically, your opponent will be holding on to their most valuable cards, and if you can force 3 random discards, there's an excellent chance you'll remove something they're desperately hoping to hold on to. But the obvious problem with this card is that despite the cost of no resources, it does count as a card and comes at the expense of leaving your Warlord exhausted. And considering this isn't even a torture event, it doesn't seem particularly useful even given the context of the upcoming Torture Specialist Warlord. So, instead, you're looking to exhaust Kith, and minding her paltry 6 hit points, it makes her an incredibly vulnerable target. She won't contribute to command if you play this during the deploy phase, and during combat she leaves herself open to being bloodied. Worse still is that though you do get to force a trio of random discards, your opponent then draws just as many cards as they were holding before. So it's possible that not only might your opponent draw cards that are just as powerful, but he or she could potentially draw into something even better. Perhaps, for instance, your opponent draws a copy of Drop Pod Assault at the expense of discarding an army unit, which would have been entirely irrelevant to combat. So, perhaps if used as a potential follow-up to Visions of Agony, you could decide to play this if you can basically guarantee that you're looking to reap significant value from Slake the Thirst. But often enough, I picture this event being woefully frustrating and unrewarding to its player, and if you're strictly looking to deprive your opponent of specific powerful card effects, Visions of Agony alone, albeit expensive, will afford you the guaranteed removal of one specific card that your opponent may be saving to counter you. This can be played played as an action, but the timing is interesting. If you play it during the deploy phase, you might prevent your opponent from being able to play their most desirable units, but then again you may not. And in either case, you will be entering into the command phase with an already exhausted Warlord. But alternatively, when played during the command phase or after the onset of combat, although your Warlord would have remained ready during the command phase and therefore may have won a command struggle for you, because your opponent is likely to have drawn cards of their own at that point, they're likely to be holding new cards entirely unknown to you, whether or not you did play Visions of Agony. So this card might be at its absolute best as your final deploy action when your opponent is holding on to as many cards that they're expecting to bring with them to combat as possible, or it may also be well played at the beginning of the deploy phase, so that you might remove a mix of considerable deployment options and subsequent meant-to-be-saved combat tricks and valuable shield cards. Perhaps someday this card might fuel a milling deck archetype, where players win through forcing their opponent to draw through their entire deck, but at present we simply don't see enough additional effects to make this at all an appetitive option. It is worth mentioning that despite causing your Warlord to exhaust, it is possible to play up to 3 copies of this event all during the same game round, because as a Warlord always elicits a battle at their planet before combat begins, even if there are no present enemy units, you have to possess a ready unit and have the chance to take a combat turn before you can win and end a battle. So you can simply choose to enter a battle already exhausted, let the first combat round conclude, and then your Warlord will ready, allowing you the opportunity to use the action window before your next available combat turn in order to exhaust your Warlord and play this event again. Simply repeat that process as many times as you'd like, and you could mill your opponent's deck for up to 9 cards. But you can't possess even a single additional unit at that planet for that strategy to work. This could also conceivably be used upon yourself, but until we see a radically different card pool, I simply cannot see using this event to do so. Overall, I find this to be a perplexing card, and for the moment, I simply do not see Slake the Thirst being at all worth the risk. You're taking a considerable gamble for only marginal gain at best, and for that reason, I certainly suggest holding off on this one. All the same, next onto our conventional Eldar. We have 3 new cards and begin with one hell of an army unit. It is the mighty Wraith Knight, costing an enormous 6 resources, but with 2 command icons, an attack value of 5, and a pool of 5 hit points. It has the vehicle, spirit, and elite traits and reads no war gear attachments. Reaction: after this unit enters play, exhaust each non-spirit unit at this planet. So, for the cost, the stats are rather underwhelming. For instance, a Warlock Destructor costs 1/3 the resources, yet hits 60% as hard, and is nearly as durable. Plus, what's worse is that this vehicle can possess no war gear attachments, and at this point in our card pool, we're at an overall dearth of hard points. Though Eldar do have one option in Star Cannon, which provides the fixed unit with the Armorbane keyword. All the same, if you're looking strictly to do Armorbane damage, why invest 6 resources and 2 cards to do so, when it'd be simpler to just run a 3-cost Iyanden Wraithguard with 1 less attack value but requiring 1 fewer card? But clearly, the appeal of this card is not found primarily in its stats, but instead its reaction. When this unit enters play, you exhaust each non-spirit unit at its planet. So ideally, this is deployed at a planet where your opponent has a huge concentration of units. Each and every one of them is immediately exhausted, and then not only does the mighty Wraith Knight contribute 2 icons to winning command, but every exhausted enemy unit no longer counts its own icons toward trumping you. Plus, when you enter the command phase, if all units are exhausted, you'll ideally be able to pick and choose which targets to eliminate prior to reaching the end of the first combat round, when all of your enemies ready. So, even if the Wraith Knight ends up exhausting several of your own units, by itself being able to attack for 5, you might be able to bring enough firepower to bear to remove the most problematic opposition regardless. Or, if you play the Mighty Wraith Knight as your first deploy action, you can then play your remaining combat-relevant units afterward in order to avoid that global exhaustion effect yourself. And for that reason, I see the Wraith Knight perhaps being most useful as a game-finishing style of effect, something to use to tilt the scales in your favor, perhaps immediately prior to a given decisive battle. It's worth noting that any spirit trait units are not affected by this unit, but outside of the Eldar there exist none, and within the Eldar faction they possess scarcely few options. The Iyanden Wraithguard and Wailing Wraithfighter are your only others at present, and while I think it's unlikely you'll have both elite spirit options at the same planet at the same time, I think it is possible that you might be able to use Wraith Guards and Wraith Knights together to wreak utter havoc on your enemy, and we stand only to see additional spirit trait units in time. Still, as is, an Armor Bane 4-value attack from a Wraith Guard could provide excellent pinpoint removal for problematic enemy units after they've been exhausted by a Wraith Knight, and with your enemy units exhausted, you may not have to worry much about the 2 HP associated with your Wraith Guard being a liability. Plus, it's definitely worth noting that the Wraith Knight's reaction triggers upon its entering play, and not strictly when it's deployed, and therefore, if you use Gift of Isha to return it from play from your discard pile, it's not only a 5-attack, 5-hit point resurrected attacker, but it again exhausts every non-spirit unit at that planet, which will include the enemy Warlord, and could therefore afford you a fantastic opportunity to either bloody your enemy, or in any case kneel and attempt to dispatch a huge volume of enemy targets, ideally after your own Warlord has attacked. And, with the assistance of shield cards, if you can dramatically limit the number of incoming attacks, it's entirely possible that, with maybe 1 or 2 copies of Gift of Isha, a Mighty Wraith Knight could, alone, manage to overcome an entire enemy army. Plus, if you're put off by that 6-resource upfront investment, consider that Yavharn could be a convenient means of, in a sense, cheating this unit into play, and then, though you don't benefit from its ability, once it does show up at a planet and eventually finds its way into your discard pile, you'll then be able to use your Gift of Isha trick to tap out the enemy army and proceed to attack. You just want to be sure that you don't let your opponent have the opportunity to put another, far less valuable Eldar faction army unit on top of your discard pile before you have a chance to recur your Wraith Knight. And the same combo can also be elicited through use of the Banshee Power Sword, which allows you to pick and choose when to discard this Eldar unit to make sure that it's on top of your discard pile. So, this is an interesting card, enormous potential, especially as we see more spirit trait units, and for the time being, it's respectably powerful as printed. So, you certainly don't want to include many of such expensive cards in your decks, but at the right time and under the correct circumstances, its ability and body could be devastating. But next, for the Eldar, we have Slumbering Gardens. It's a 1-cost support with the location trait and interrupt. When an effect would move a unit you control from a planet, exhaust this support to cancel that effect. So this support is a bit of a troubling card. It's certainly affordable, but it's a very situational effect, and against many decks will quite simply do nothing. So it's definitely a meta call in that respect, because in general decks want to run as few supports as possible. They don't come with shields, and they don't help contribute to your winning command. But if you're concerned about your units being undesirably relocated, let's consider our forced movement effects. We have Sicarius's Chosen and the Vile Laboratory, for instance, two signature cards which force units to move to adjacent planets, and you could use this support too, one time per phase, cancel that effect. Or, perhaps if you're playing with An-Shi as your chosen warlord, ethereal trait units generally flee planets after attacking, and Slumbering Gardens would also prevent that escape from happening. However, in this very war pack, our Tau faction receives an enormously powerful support that helps negate that forced reaction and provides far more flexibility than does this support. Still, you could run the two of them together to force ethereal trait units, perhaps weighed down with attachments, to stick around at a planet, but it is critically important to note that Slumbering Gardens only cancels movement and no other effect. It cannot cancel routing or retreating, and therefore is quite explicitly limited in its effect, especially considering that the Eldar and allied factions have myriad other ways of relocating their units, such as the mobile keyword or movement effects like that printed upon Wild Rider's squadron. Slumbering Gardens may be entirely unnecessary, so depending upon the development of our card pool, this could someday come into vogue. But for the time being, it just seems far too situational and context-specific to be worth including in any kind of all-comers general play deck. Definitely one to remember, but for the moment, one I can't quite recommend that you play. Still, last up for our Eldar, we have an event. It is Seer's Exodus with a cost of 0, a single shield icon, as well as the power trait. It reads, action, move one or more units you control at a planet with your warlord to your HQ. So, if it looks as if you're going to be slaughtered, or you've inadvertently sent your warlord and company into a trap, you can play this event to immediately evacuate any number of units from that planet. If you'd rather not wait or simply can't quite make it to the end of a combat round in order to be allowed an opportunity to retreat, then to spare a potentially significant number of your deployed units from being destroyed, you can proceed to play this event. Or, if your opponent plays something surprising like a drop pod assault, anything which means you know that your warlord is about to be bloodied, or perhaps that you're going to end up losing an invaluable other unit, you can use Seer's Exodus to instantaneously save yourself. But this is an incredibly defensive card, and in general, you don't want to retreat, because when you remove units from planets, often you're going to be giving up during combat at a planet and failing to activate its associated battle ability. Plus, you're also affording that missed opportunity to your opponent. But whether you turn what could have been a crushing loss into only a marginal defeat, this event could let you theoretically regroup and end up salvaging the game. The problem, though, is that it seems like Seer's Exodus will still keep you in somewhat of an unfavorable position, because although you may have managed to keep your warlord hale or otherwise spared one or more of your units from destruction, they'll nevertheless all end up in your headquarters, and anytime there exist army units in your HQ, they not only constrict and limit your warlord's options for where they should be sent during the following round's command phase, but those same saved units will arrive at your chosen planet exhausted, where they're entirely vulnerable to the enemy during the first round of combat. and they also won't contribute their icons to winning command struggles. Generally speaking, defensive effects are vastly inferior to offensive in Conquest LCG, and Eldar, as well as their possible allied factions, all have at least some access to similar card effects, which could allow them other options to avoid or escape undesirable combats. Still, all the same, this card could serve as a reasonable panic button, or perhaps an alternatively compelling use for Seer's Exodus is to salvage command struggle deadlocks. For instance, if you've deployed a significant number of card or resource bonus providing economy units to a planet, only to end up being beaten in command icons by the timely play of perhaps a promotion or a similar effect by your enemy, after sending your Warlord to that planet that round to ensure that you win command, you can use Seer's Exodus as an action after the command phase to sweep those economy units into your HQ, and then commit them alongside your Warlord again the following round, allowing you to reap those same bonuses without feeling restricted in regard to where you send your Warlord, because you can now safely ignore your previously commit to planet, and instead deliver your Warlord to the utmost important location. And in addition to hopefully winning that valuable, what may have seemed lost at the very last moment command struggle, you'll not only reel in those additional card and resource bonuses after all, but you'll proceed to either leave those same units to win command at that non-first planet for you during the following round, or otherwise keep those economy units entering and exiting your HQ if you repeatedly commit your Warlord to the first planet, which still affords you the same opportunity to continue to derive benefit from their bonuses. In conjunction with mobile or signature card effects such as Foresight, Seer's Exodus could also allow you to not just reposition your units, but also your Warlord, so that you can still elicit and participate in battles wherever you'd like. Plus, you can also use this event during combat as insurance, while being more risky and frivolous when it comes to exhausting your Warlord than you'd otherwise be, and you could even use the unknown presence of this card in your hand as a means of luring your opponent into a false sense of confidence, perhaps encouraging them to overcommit and direct all possible firepower and combat tricks to your Warlord, and then, at the last possible moment, you use Seer's Exodus to whisk yourself away instead of letting yourself be bloodied. And especially if you can rely on Iridial being somewhere on the board, then you can hopefully severely punish your opponent for their overinvestment in committing to an attempt to bloody your Warlord. But, as a means of bringing this event's evaluation to a close, there are a few additional niche uses inherent to this event worth mentioning. For instance, if the game-deciding battle is about to begin, and your HQ is full of army units, but your Warlord is bloodied and the opponent is holding the initiative token, you can commit fearlessly to the necessary planet, knowing that you'll be able to pull your Warlord away from that battle before your opponent can destroy you and cost you the game. Or you can send your Warlord to a planet where you definitely want to keep the initiative, but still dread some fearsome enemy unit, and in that case, you can show up, maintain initiative during battle, and maybe even deliver an attack with your Warlord before immediately extracting your command unit. Another option would be to deliver a volley of attacks with your fragile ranged units, and then remove them from that planet in order to preserve them for a following round. Or, if you know that you're not going to be winning a battle anyways, in a low unit count conflict, you could simply derive value by attacking with one of your units and then escaping before you end up having that unit destroyed. So, Seer's Exodus is certainly versatile in its tactical implications, but not exactly one I consider enormously powerful. This event could be used for bluffing, and this could even be used in conjunction with our upcoming Tau support to allow An-Shi all the more opportunity to trigger battles and win battle abilities on a tremendous number of planets. So, overall, an intriguing and versatile card, definitely one which I'll be watching as our card pool develops, but given its current utility, it's not one that I'll personally be playing. Still, as last of our factions, we end with the Tau. We have 2 new card options, and first is an army unit, the Fire Warrior Grenadiers. For 3 resources, we get a unit with no command icons, an attack value of 2, 2 hit points, and the Soldier and Chasselas traits. It reads, for each ethereal unit you control at this planet, this unit gets +2 attack and gains 1 command icon. So this is a very provocative card because of its incredible potential. For each and every ethereal trait unit located at its planet, it gains a significant cumulative bonus relevant to both combat and command. Presuming that Anshi is your chosen warlord, if you deploy this unit to a planet and then send your ethereal trait warlord there, the Fire Warrior Grenadiers immediately increase to an attack value of 4 and possess a single command icon, putting it on par and approximately even to Borkon recruits, albeit at the cost of 1 additional resource. However, keep in mind that for each additional ethereal beyond the first, that same bonus keeps on growing, and not only can the attack value become monumentally high, but it can do so entirely unexpectedly. For instance, if you have Fire Warrior Grenadiers at a planet and you send Anshi to that location, you have an attack value of 4. But if during combat you ambush an Ennui Prelate into play, that unit gives your other Tau units a +1 attack boost, raising the Grenadiers' total to 5. But because that new unit itself is an ethereal, it elevates your attack value to 7, and considering that Anshi is present, that attack would be Armorbane, easily capable of bloodying or destroying almost every warlord printed thus far, in nearly every situation. Or, if the Ennui Prelate is too expensive for your taste, let's consider instead a simple alternative. Just play Ethereal Wisdom on your Fire Warrior Grenadiers. It immediately gets a +1 attack bonus from the event, and also gains the Ethereal trait. But since the Grenadiers specify they receive that additive bonus for each Ethereal present at the planet, they also count themselves, and thanks to that zero-cost event, again, alongside Anshi, that's another easily accomplished means of attaining a modified 7 attack value. Plus, you can mix, match, and combine those and any number of other attack-augmenting effects for all the more additional damage output. And of course, if you already have a number of ethereal trait units located at that same planet, the Grenadier's effect only becomes all the more powerful, although in that case, you may well end up with a significant surplus of essentially unnecessary command icons, especially if you intend to send your warlord to that planet. But in having the Grenadiers positioned at such a planet, when threatening your enemy with such enormous amounts of attack power, you could easily win a command struggle not just because of a huge number of icons, but also because the Grenadiers will generally provide an enormous deterrent for your opponent to send their warlord to that same location. Obviously, there's little to nothing preventing your opponent from routing this unit, or exhausting it, or dealing it enough damage to wear through its meager 2 hit points through card effects, or simply attacking it with their own units. But this could just be one effect among many with which to threaten and add additional pressure to your opponent. And it only costs 3, so the game is far from over if the Grenadiers happen to be countered. Keep in mind that with the help of Kauyon Strike, with or without Ethereal Wisdom to transform the Fire Warrior Grenadiers itself into a relocatable Ethereal, this unit could unexpectedly blast an enemy Warlord or Death Star type unit into oblivion, and that combo becomes all the more powerful when we consider this war pack's next Tau faction inclusion. So, the Grenadiers can require a bit of setup, but often it's no more than a mere 2-card combo. Still, while you may opt instead only to run Borcon recruits, these Fire Warriors regardless offer an alluring complement or alternative, but no matter the case, this unit is clearly tremendously powerful and should always be something you'll want to remain cognizant of whenever playing against or as Anshi. But as the very last of our The Threat Beyond cards, we have a Tau faction support, one that many consider to be one of the most powerful cards in the game. It is the Xim Yen Orbital City. For 2 resources, it has a loyal icon and the location trait. It reads Combat Action. Exhaust this support to move an ethereal unit from your HQ to a target planet, then ready that unit. So this is an enormously powerful non-unique support. The hallmark of ethereal trait units thus far is to possess a forced reaction, which requires they move to your HQ after resolving their attack. And the combat action of this support allows you to move an ethereal from your HQ to whatever planet you want, and then also to ready that unit, an effect which you'll certainly want to trigger after your opponent takes their combat turn, because your freshly relocated unit will be immediately able to make its own attack. For as many copies of Xim Yen Orbital City as you have in play, you can receive additional attacks. For instance, perhaps you have Anshi sitting at a planet, and your opponent is out of ready units. You can play an Ennui Prelate from your hand and exhaust it to declare an attack against an enemy unit. Because Anshi is present, you strike for Armor Bane 4, the Prelate's forced reaction triggers, and its move to your HQ. Then, you use an Orbital City as a combat action to move the Ennui Prelate back to that planet and ready it. It attacks again for 4, again with the Armor Bane keyword, and then once again returns to the safety of your HQ. If you have additional copies of Orbital City, you can repeat that process additional times, and considering that Anshi himself is an ethereal trait unit, between Orbital City and Kaoyan Strike, you can not only potentially assassinate innumerable enemy units in bouncing from planet to HQ and back again, but in doing so, you can elicit, participate in, and potentially win a tremendous number of battles and trigger any number of associated abilities each round. For instance, let's say that during the command phase, Anshi was commit to planet number 1. You fight a battle at that planet, and if you end up walking away the victor, you capture that planet and trigger its battle ability. Whether or not he attacked, Anshi will at some point then enter your HQ, and you can use an orbital city to send him to planet 2. A battle will subsequently begin at that planet as a warlord is present, and at some point during that combat, perhaps you ensure that Anshi attacks, which means he again moves to your HQ. After that battle, you can then use another orbital city to move Anshi to the 3rd planet to trigger another subsequent battle there, or you can use Kaoyan Strike to accomplish a nearly identical effect. Just note with that event, you'll ideally be moving Anshi at the very beginning of a new combat round when he's ready and unexhausted and is therefore able to attack when repositioned to a new planet where he necessarily forces an additional battle to take place. And considering that it can be extraordinarily difficult for your opponent to distribute combat units among multiple planets, especially those that can survive an Armor Bane 2 attack, even if Anshi won't be left behind to sit at a planet after dispatching lone enemies if unaided by any of your other units, something that means he won't be hanging around long enough to technically win those battles, and as a result trigger those planets' associated abilities, you may kill off a huge number of vulnerable enemy or economy units regardless, and if you do end up destroying all enemy opposition present at a planet, and possess even a mere recon drones or any other single unit of yours still sitting at that planet, even though a zero attack economy unit like that one may under usual circumstances be essentially worthless success in combat itself, by merit of your Warlord having triggered a battle and your having even one unit present when all enemy units have been vanquished, you will still win that planet, and as a result be granted the opportunity to trigger that battle ability. And over time, those bonus additional card effects could definitely add up considerably. And of course, if you do have combat units ready and available at the planets you move your Warlord to, being able to shift the location of a unit which grants all friendly Tau at that planet the Armorbane keyword can be devastating, and that effect stands to become all the more powerful if An-Shi is equipped with his +1 attack bonus gifting Honor Blade. So, as direct result of all which we've discussed, an early game orbital city or two can make an enormous difference in regard to how An-Shi is piloted, and it allows him incredible opportunities to elicit multiple battles each round. It increases the probability that you'll be able to successfully assassinate the enemy Warlord to be dramatically higher than ever it was before, and for all these reasons and more, this support is not just a mandatory 3-copy inclusion in any deck featuring An-Shi, but it's definitely something you'll pray for to end up in your opening hand, and certainly something worth considering attempting a mulligan to draw. It seems almost worthless when played by Commander Shadowsun, but is frankly inexcusable not to use with An-Shi. So, by all means, play this card and take full advantage of the ability it affords you to harass and whittle away at your opponent's army at each and every available opportunity. Once per round, per copy of the Orbital City, you can potentially kill a lone enemy unit and trigger an additional battle and or activate an additional battle ability. This support is incredibly useful, and I cannot over-convey the power therein. While An-Shi is traveling from planet to planet, you could even use Seer's Exodus in order to gather up your most desirable units for subsequent next round concentration and commitment to a game-deciding planet. Especially considering just how scarce that support destruction is in our current card pool, there is very little an opponent can do to counter this effect. But if you're the player going up against this support and do have the option to destroy an orbital city, ensure that you do so when your opponent leaves themselves vulnerable, when you can leave them stranded in their HQ and disallow them from doing something devious. Or again, if you're the player benefiting from the use of this support, keep in mind that a lone An-Shi, if he can't clear all enemy units from a planet, you may well end up affording your opponent the chance to win that battle, and you could pay dearly in letting your enemy trigger a planetary ability. Be aware that your Warlord killing an enemy unit and bouncing back to your HQ, only for your opponent to play an eager recruit to that planet and to end up winning that battle, could provide a huge benefit to them. If the planet in question happens to be something like the card or resource bonus granting Taurus, or something in that moment equally valuable. But now that we've covered each and every card included within the Threat Beyond War Pack, I'd like to thank you once again for watching. We've seen not only our first 5 Warlord Cycle Warlords in previous videos, but have now also discussed our first 5 full expansions as well. What are your thoughts, opinions, and perspective regarding the contents of the Threat Beyond? What are some of your best and worst play experiences with any or all of these cards, and how does the Threat Beyond hold up with time as the 5th of our war packs? Please let me know in the comments, because with your input, these videos stand only to become all the better resources for players both novice and veteran alike in time. But thank you once again for watching, and If you enjoyed this content, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, I always encourage you to share this content, because the more newcomers there are that stumble upon Conquest, the more people may give it a try, end up enjoying the game, and someday join our community. And, of course, together we all stand to send the message to Fantasy Flight Games to continue to support this fantastic product. If at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free to do so through Facebook or on Twitter, and if you ever feel so inclined to give back to this channel to help support the Hive Tyrant, I would be absolutely honored were you to consider donation to my Patreon. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.